He does an entire book that is literally a D&D party and their weird sexual adventures. It's hysterical, and it's still interesting storytelling. You can have boobs, breasts, vagina, gore, blood, guts, everything, as long as the story is good. And I think a lot of independent artists realize that.
And you have been listening to Comic Indie After Dark. All right.
Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast. Comic Indie Podcast.
Welcome to Comic Indie Podcast. My name is Ken Javier.
I'm Alex A.
And once and forever, I am Daniel.
And welcome to the new and improved fun-sized edition of the Comic Indie Podcast. We've heard you, we've listened, and we've heard your feedback that, hey, maybe you guys are talking a little bit too long, and we might not want to hear you that long. I don't know. I'm just making the assumption because I have low self-esteem sometimes, but that's where the medicine comes in.
People, shut us! Shut us!
But in any event, we do want to make this, a little bit more bite-sized, a little bit more compact, and so today we are going to talk about indie comics, as always, but more specifically about indie comics. We're going to talk about what are some things that indie comics can get away with that the mainstreams like the big boys of DC and Marvel cannot. So, Alex, what do you think about our subject today?
I think it's great. I mean, we're talking about something that the mainstream media usually does not get a good dosage of, and that's just everything R-rated, everything that's violent and bloody, and everything that your mom doesn't want you to see, but guess what? You get to see it anyway. But yeah, I think it's a great topic because we get to explore a little bit of why indie publishers have the advantage. And Marvel and DC kind of don't. So, I mean, my take on it is it's not what can they get away with, but it's more like what can the big two not get away with.
So, if I understand correctly, it seems like, Marvel and the DCs, they're a little bit more restricted and they don't have like the really free reign to throw out their, NC-17 books or rated R books. Wouldn't say rated X book because I'm not really into all that. I don't know about you guys. Some people are, not to criticize, but I think the Marvel and the DCs, I think they have to kind of consider their audience. Are they willing to put up with that angry mom or dad, or I don't. Honestly, my dad really didn't care what comic books I read, but my mom.
You were reading, right?
Exactly right, but like, are they willing to put up with somebody kind of just saying, hey, you're putting out some trash, garbage stuff that I don't want you polluting the mind of my kids. I thought you guys were good comic books, but apparently you guys are like the Grand Theft Auto or the Marilyn Manson of comics now.
If I maybe funny thing you bring that up, when I was a kid. I used to collect comics left, right, and center, which is most of us did. And I came home one time with a copy of Dead Man, which was a great book. Kelly Jones did the art. It was just a beautiful Vertigo title. I got it because it was, I was 13 years old. It was a great title, good to work with. I think it was called Love Never Sleeps or something to that effect. Anyway, the thing is that my mom was home, and my mom said, "Oh, you have books?" I said, "Yeah, I do." She says, "Can I see them?" I said, "I guess, sure." My mom grabs it, pulls out the Dead Man amongst all the books I had there. Pulls out the one Dead Man, opens it up right to the sex scene, then promptly closes it, hands it right back to me, and says, "Well, you go enjoy."
Wow.
Later
you got a pretty
on,
cool mom.
well, after it was a minor, soft R. sex scene. So you're just talking like little toplessness, you're done. The funny thing is that years later, my mom, again, understanding that I'm a comic book fan, bought me the Absolute Edition of Watchmen for Christmas one year. And this is before the movie came out, before Alan Moore was a household name. And she says, "Well, what's the big deal about it?" So I pull it out of the sleeve lovingly, and I say, "Hey, take a look, take a read." She does, and she promptly opens up right to the sex scene between Night Owl and Silk Spectre again.
Oh, so it wasn't the blue penis from
No.
Mr. Manhattan?
Well, she flipped to a couple other pages and got that too. So it's like, you know what? I just can't win.
Yeah.
Since then, my mom has not flipped at a single book that I own. Goodness. But yeah, that's the great thing about indie books, though, because indie books, you can get away with a lot of interesting details and a lot of problems. DC and Marvel, like you were saying, can't, and that has a lot to do with the Comics Code Authority that was slapped down in the late 50s.
So you're talking about that little piece of, because I like to collect some old books every now and again, but it's that little black and white square thing that says Comiccode. It looks like a stamp, basically.
It does very much look like a stamp.
Printed on that. Okay, so what about that stamp, and I know you're going to lay down on us because we love history. Yep. So what's going on with the Comic Code Authority and why was it created?
Okay. Way back in the day, set your Wayback Machines to sometime in the 1950s when things like the House Un-American Activities was considered a spectator sport. We had a book come out called Seduction of the Innocent by Dr. Wortham, who basically claimed that all comic books were destroying people, encouraging homosexuality, encouraging violence, encouraging gangs, encouraging all the stuff that when we were growing up was blamed on heavy metal. So he went to the courts and said comics need to be banned. So they got Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, the writers at DC, the writers at EC Comics and Fawcett Comics to all go get on the stand and say, no, this is fine. We're okay. We're not encouraging lascivious behavior or violent behavior. These are just action books. These are fine. Which all apparently would have gone well until the guy who created EC Comics, where you get Tales from the Crypt and
Crypt Keeper and all that, right?
Yeah, apparently he went crazy on the stand and started talking about conspiracy theories and strange werewolf in the night and so forth, and they kind of said, okay, we see the halfway point here, and rather than having the government come in and say, we're going to enforce stuff on you now, the comics company said, okay, we're going to establish the Comics Code Authority so the government doesn't have to. It's kind of like when movies way back in the day used to be non-rated, and then they said, look, we're going to put in a rating system so that people don't come down on movies with an iron fist. So when that happened, comics had to abide by certain regulations. You could not show nudity. You could not show extreme violence. You could not show drug use. You could not show, oddly enough, very specifically, werewolves, ghouls, or vampires for years, thanks to EC Comics. So people had to abide by that. Consequentially, and also culturally, you had a lot of lamer comics. You know, this is definitely the era when superheroes did not kill whatsoever. I mean, this is before then. I'm actually really good with that. But this is an era when superheroes had to be very relaxed in what they were doing. You couldn't have a lot of gore, a lot of violence, or a lot of, even just a kiss on screen was considered, can we get away with this? Very popularly, Spider-Man one time actually was printed without the Comics Code Authority stamp simply because they wanted to show 3 issues where Spider-Man's best friend, Harry Osborn, gets addicted to drugs and the bad things that happen when you get involved with drugs. Because it was a drugs-related comic, the Comics Code Authority said, you can't print this. So Stan Lee went to his publishers and said, we're going to print this, and they did, and it was one of the best-selling books at the time. So the Comics Code Authority has really limited, and then the traditions that have been built off from that have continued. So this is why you have a lot of superhero stereotypes that have continued into cartoons, into various other forms of media, and it just continued until the Comics Code Authority dropped in 2013, I believe, or something like that. But then you had other titles come out where independent comics started becoming more mainstream, where your Vertigos, your Max Lines, and so forth.
So it sounds like as people's sensibilities, or I guess their tolerances, or just basically what would be acceptable changed, so did the Comic Code Authority.
Very much
so. Really, I think, I guess what was the time period for the Comic Code Authority?
You're talking probably somewhere in the 60s to at least the 2000s.
So I'm really interested to kind of see, and I'm sure they're out there. I know they're out there. But between the 60s and the 2000s, that's where the indie industry could really thrive and kind of get away with, we don't really want to watch the Superman-esque type guys, punching the bad guy who is trying to, end the world. Let's watch more of the superhero guy who's addicted to drugs and maybe beats on his wife. Not that that's a good thing. That's a terrible thing, mind you. Just terrible. terrible. But you know
That's
what?
okay. Marvel had a superhero beating his wife.
Was that Ant-Man?
That was Ant-Man and Wasp.
Oh my goodness, is Ant-Man going to do that? Paul Rudd should not beat his wife.
Well,
he's such a cool dude.
Well, okay, gotta remember that was Hank Pym. Hank Pym's wife is no longer in the picture in the movie, so we won't have to deal with that. So that's the good news.
Domestic violence, it will ruin lives.
It
How
did.
they did it back in the day.
Yeah,
That's how
exactly.
they did it. Did you know that the rule of thumb was about a stick that you could beat your wife with, and not about a thumb?
Yep.
Or the stick has to be the size of your thumb, and it's okay to beat your wife. Not okay now.
Wow.
Yep.
But people still say it. It's kind of weird. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I guess people looked to indie books and they had that need or something just kind of feel taboo, and they kind of had to get some of that stuff out there. When I think about, indie and just some other things too, it's and Alex kind of alluded to it, it's just that violence, It was kind of really just more, for me, and I kind of equate a lot of things to video games, is pre-Mortal Kombat, you really couldn't see anything like that violence whether it be in a comic book, and it was just really out there, and it was really kind of cool to see. So kind of looking at the indie books of today, and not necessarily of the 60s up into the 2000s, what are some things now that we think are getting away, or what are some things that are like, holy, what am I looking at here?
Yeah, because even though the Comicode Authority is no longer in force, we still have you still have a panel of investors sitting around a table, pretty much just deciding on what can and can't print. And I'm sure writers are aware of this. They have to cater to the audience, to kids, and what will parents think. So it kind of borders in the imagination into what you can and can't do. So that's one of the things I find really interesting with indie comics, is that they don't have those restrictions. Really, it's one guy sitting down thinking, you know what, I think it'd be great if I had, vampires shooting up the place and blood, gore, and guess what? Here comes a angry swarm of whores coming.
Angry swarm of whores.
By the way,
is that a book?
That is a
hold
book.
on, let's write that down. Oh, it is a book, so never mind.
Yeah, I was about to say, we talked about the violence and everything else coming to this. There was a time period when the independents kind of invaded mainstream comics. Like I said, you get your Vertigo titles, you get your Marvel Max titles, where there was a lot of violence, a lot of nudity, a lot of stuff you couldn't get away with. But then you had a couple of writers out there who I respect as writers. I respect what they do. They're very popular.
Hit him with the butt.
I despise them. And that would be people like Garth Ennis. Garth Ennis is a great example. If you want to know what can you get away with independent comics you can't get away with major books, there is a book out there very popular called The Boys. I don't know if it's currently published by Dynamite Comics, but it is an anti-superhero story that, let's see, the first graphic novel of which has involved a speedster accidentally tearing off the arms of an innocent woman, a girl auditioning to be in the equivalent of the Global Guardians or whatever league by having to service, for lack of a better term, all the male members of the particular group before she gets in. You have literally someone's face peeled off and put on a pizza. And this is the first graphic novel of like 8 or 10 of these things. It is disgusting. It is gross. It is absolutely just out there. But it is unbelievably popular because of people like Garth Ennis, who then, either before or after, I don't know my continuity at this point, did things like Punisher, has brought us Preacher, which is now an ABC series. AMC.
I would love to see Preacher in ABC.
Oh God,
that would be
no, that'd be
great
Disney FUD. You don't want that.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
But this is a guy who, he and a very similar storyteller has brought the indie touch of, well, we don't care about the Comicode Authority. We don't care about what can and cannot be said on screen. We're just going to tell what we want to read, and apparently what these guys want to read does not make me want to spend time in a room with them. It's just kind of out there.
And that's so strange. It's just like, I was thinking about it the other day, and it's like comics, and granted, I know, I mean, it has a huge following. A lot of people know about them, but it's just like there's so many like messed up things out there. And again, I'm going to go back to the video games and that is just like, I'm not condoning it. I'm not saying that, you know, it shouldn't be done, but like there's just some stuff that's just not for me, you know. But it's just kind of like, wow, people actually think like this and they put it out there. And what's funny is, like you said, there's an audience for everything. It's like I think one of the last topics we talked about was not free trade,
public domain.
Public domain, right? So there's a whole sect of, you know, public domain, Hansel and Gretel, but it's like sexy Hansel and Gretel, and they really kind of just really pervert the story for lack of better terms. And for what? You know, this is like a kid's fairy tale. Granted, I understand it didn't really start out as a kid's fairy tale, but they just really have taken some liberties on it, and liberties meaning they are showing some boobs and some vaginas and things going into them, and it's just like, again, not for me, but definitely not for the Marvel, not for DC.
For counterbalance on that one, when you bring up that particular point, you also have things like Lost Girls, which take, again, public domain, three public domain characters: Wendy from Peter Pan, Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, and Alice from The Looking Glass. And they basically tell the story of these three women who have now become women in a 1915, basically around a World War I, German hotel where they end up not only sharing their sexual histories, which tie very much into the stories that have been done, but also end up having sex with each other a lot. And I mean a lot. However, this was an Alan Moore, I cannot remember the woman's first name. I think it was Melanie Gibbs, who he later married. I've read it before, and it's not just the, oh dear God, smut for smut's sake. It is amazing. It is just amazing storytelling that only Alan Moore can do. But at the same time, you would never get away with that in mainstream books or anything else like that, because while it's telling the stories of sexual development and sexual proclivities and how things look to certain people that match these stories and these fairy tales in a way that becomes Jungian and iconic and even a little Freudian, at the same time, yeah, you're not going to sit your kid brother down and say, hey, have you read Lost Girls? Unless you either really like or really don't like your kid brother. Okay, so
if I hear you correctly, breast and vaginas are okay for indie books as long as they're done tastefully and they're written by Alan Moore. Is that correct?
Not everybody. There's plenty more breasts and vaginas and asses that can be seen on anything. Like I said, and anybody else can do them, and they can do them well, and they can do it badly. There's also a niche of independent comics which specializes in this. So you have your X-rated books, which still come out these days. Yeah. Some of which are just, hi, this is smut because we're bored. Some of it is really good. Phil Folgio, another great example. He's an independent comic person. He's made a business out of his own title with Girl Genius. Before then, he released a comic called Xenophile, which was just short little vignettes about strange sexual situations that happen, whether by science fiction or fantasy or magic. He does an entire book that is literally a D&D party and their weird sexual adventures. It's hysterical, and it's still interesting storytelling. You can have boobs, breasts, vagina, gore, blood, guts, everything, as long as the story is good. And I think a lot of independent artists realize that.
And you have been listening to Comic Indie After Dark. All right, so how about this one here? Here's a funny story. So when I was a kid in middle school, I used to love Wizard, the comic guide book, right?
The trade man.
Yeah. So Wizard, right? So what I used to do is I used to cut out little pictures from Wizard and put little collages, and I'd put the collage like inside of my it wasn't a trapper keeper, but basically it was a binder that had a little plastic folder. And so I made a collage one time with several pictures of Vampirella. That's the female like vampire, or was this Vampirella or Vampiress, or
she was a vampire. So the woman in the string bikini.
In the string. So think about, like, you remember the movie Borat, where he wore that one piece string bikini, the mankini. Yeah. So it was a red version, and what ends up happening at age 12, when you make a collage out of that, your teacher gets very upset, and they tell you to turn that collage inside out, and they're going to tell your parents, and they say you're looking at I don't know, like pornography, but it wasn't. The nipples were covered. So what's the ruling on that? If the nipple is covered, is that pornography?
Well, okay. What's the old story about pornography? I don't know I can't classify it, but I know it when I see it. So says a judge.
Oh, okay.
When it comes to the Comic Code's authority, when it comes to mainstream comics, and please don't, but don't ignore you. When it comes to the Comics Code authority, when you deal with nudity, it depends on the book. It depends on the age frame it's pointed at. But essentially, no. Breasts had to be covered. Not like fully covered, because there's Age of Ultron recently happened where Ultron came into a human female form, and you had what they call strategic wisps of smoke. You had...
You talking about like Tony Stark, Age of Ultron?
Indeed.
I don't remember that scene in the movie, Dan.
It's not the movie. This is the comics.
Oh,
where they did
okay.
actually... The comics is based... The movie was supposed to be based on the comics in this particular regard. Whatever. But basically, Ultron tried to once again make a new body for himself, and this one turned out to be a human female that just happened to be buck naked, because Frank Cho is good at the buck naked. But that's the thing. For years, there have always been what they call strategic nudity. There's been a character that I've known since the 70s in Marvel called Cloud. Very minor character. If you have an old handbook of the Marvel Universe, they have an entry. And it's a sentient cloud that takes human form. It's a human form that is essentially somebody nude, except for this cloud right around where the bar would go if the sensor was there. And you have all sorts of almosts and kindas and could-be's and illusions to this sort of stuff happening in comics for years. There was actually an old comic in the 80s where Spider-Man and Mary Jane got married, and Aunt May came by to say hi, and number one, they have a picture of a full-page spread of Mary Jane in the shower with, again, strategic water, strategic smoke, so you can't see anything. And Aunt May picks up this folder going, oh, you and Peter been doing photography? And apparently Mary Jane and Peter have been doing photography that was not meant for the general public.
Oh, wow.
In the story, Aunt May doesn't know what to do until Mary Jane takes the pictures and subtly and quote-unquote accidentally burns them in front of Aunt May, to which she says, "Thank you, dear," and they go get a cup of tea.
And herein lies another problem with a lot of the mainstream comics, is that you don't have one writer doing Spider-Man. You have 100 writers with their own take and their own version and vision of what they want to do, and you see all these different iterations, explorations, titles. It's kind of you don't get this consistent version of Spider-Man. Whereas, of course, if you go to an indie publisher, you have that one writer writing this one character, and it's going to be consistent throughout. I think another crazy thing with what a lot of mainstream comic companies do is, I mean, and I know this doesn't surprise anybody, but there's a resurrection, and a death doesn't mean anything for anybody. We all know Superman's going to come back to life. How many times have these characters all died, and it's just you don't have that feeling, oh well, that's it, you know.
Speaking of feelings, if Superman has a erection, that's going to be in there. Look at that. There, okay,
that was a dad joke. That was bad.
Yeah. I'm a great dad joke teller, all right? This is the Comic Indie Dad Joke Podcast, all right? So I'm sorry, Alex.
But that's the thing. I see what you mean.
Get your roll on there.
I see what you mean. There's
Insert advertisement for the blue pill here.
That's it.
But at the same time, yeah, you're like, it's true. When you're an independent artist, God, what the heck was his name? The Aardvark. Not Cerberus. It was, oh God, it's gonna...
Bone.
No, not Bone. The other guy. The guy who did the Barbarian Aardvark. He literally said in the 80s, he said, you know what? I'm going to write this for 300 issues, and nobody can stop me. And he did. It's Sarah
Guru.
Not Gru the Wanderer. That was Sergo Agnes, though he's still doing that one for 30 years.
Just throwing out everything.
I know.
It's all swatted down.
That's all right. No, it's Cerberus, the Aardvark, which started off as a kind of a bad Conan story, and then eventually involved Spawn, and eventually involved knockoffs of other heroes. He wrote this thing for 30 years, and when it got to issue 300, he killed the character and was done. But he kept, as you were saying, the singular vision throughout of what this character is like and what this character should be, and he meets a very bad, messy end because he lives a very bad, messy life. But in the same way that, Jean Grey, you have an idea of what the character's like, but she can twist and change as things happen. But she's been dead and alive, as she even as the writer said, she has been dead and resurrected so many times. She's her own cliche. So yeah, you need to have that consistency you get with independence.
All right. So what have we learned today? We learned that indie books will allow us to show nudity. It'll allow us to show vaginas and breasts. They'll allow us to show blood and gore.
Oh, wow.
We also learned that back in the day, people were kind of prudes and didn't like to look at that stuff, except for the Tales from the Crypt pervert guy, who probably, if I get this correct, he was the reason why it was created, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut.
Yeah, and guess what he did when he got when he was no longer allowed to do comics anymore? You know what he did?
What'd he do?
Mad Magazine.
Mad Magazine, where you fold the flap in the back that turns one picture into another hilarious picture, or sometimes some type of awesome dad pun. So thank you, Mad Magazine. But no, definitely by putting up that comic code of authority, it's allowed, other indie artists to kind of put some stuff out there that other people wouldn't have a chance to see. From what I understand, and Dan, I know you're the wealth of knowledge on this one here, it sounds like there's a ton of great indie stuff out there that really pushes the limit. Via Alan Moore, and there's a lot of not so great, but not necessarily condemning, just not for you, Dan, probably not for me, I don't know.
Everybody has
Alex,
their likes.
I'm not sure about it. I'm just kidding. But of the Garth Ennises of the world, but definitely indies are able to push an envelope, push an edge, and it will give a voice to those who don't have a voice. I don't know if maybe that's overstating that
Honestly,
one.
I think it does, because, and I know we're running out of time here, but at the same time, you get all those, you had gay characters being portrayed in
and
comic
these
books.
this is another category.
Yeah.
It's
Thematic, these questionable thematic subjects that the mainstream media or the mainstream comic industry just won't touch. I mean, you've got things like transgender, things that are even controversial in nature, like for example, the beauty industry. There's this one Image comic called Beauty, which I thought was really fascinating because it dealt with sexually transmitted disease that made you attractive. And this is looking at an industry of people that, they want to be. The image nowadays all over the commercials is, how do you look like the next supermodel? So you're geared to all these advertisements of what to eat, what to drink, what to wear, and this artist has a really cool take on the theme of this sexually transmitted disease that makes you attractive, but it ends up killing you inside, and toward the end you end up dying as a piece of art somehow.
Because you're constantly just get more and more beautiful until you are just like a piece of art. Nice. But I mean, that's the thing. You have all these other great subjects to play with that, I mean, people like Crumb, he took on race politics in the 60s when it was still a huge hot topic. He was, Crumb was in some ways, I'd like to say, one of the grandfathers of what we consider indie comics. Because he's the guy who brought us Fritz the Cat and a lot of just really underground, what might be called hippie books. But you have all these great artists even today who don't want to play by the Marvel and DC rules, who want to say, look, I want something I want to say. Faith, you have your first body positive,
overweight,
overweight, plus
Valiant,
size,
right?
And from Valiant.
Yeah, okay.
You had,
And She Flies.
And She Flies. Why not? You had Omaha the Cat Dancer, which also dealt with homosexuality, AIDS, prostitution, all these topics you can never get away with, and it was a furry book, but it was a very serious furry book, and it actually told a good story. There's tons of books out there, some of which I enjoy, some of which I don't. Read for yourself. We always encourage the reading people. But at the same time, when you get an indie book, there's just so much you can say, because there's not a stockholder above you. There's not a government agency above you. There's nobody above you to say, what in the hell do you think you're doing? And if there's not, you get to say, I know what I'm doing, and this is what I'm doing.
So, Dan, if I were to say there was this universe where a new planet was found and this race of aliens were dying, and the only way to save them is through circumcisions, but those circumcisions were some type of weird way to steal their essence, would you want to read that book?
I have no idea.
All right, just saying, that sounds pretty indie, but if Marvel wants to pick up that story, I know a great writer. All right? All right, just letting you know, I put in my copyright for my book, Tales from Newest Mexico, coming out 2018. So anyways, I'll cut that one out.
Okay.
So in any event, for Comic Indie, I'm Ken Javier.
I'm Alex A.
And as always, I'm Daniel. We encourage you to continue to listen to our podcasts as they come out. Now, if you are interested in talking to us, if you want to be interviewed by us, if you want to tell Comic Indie that we're doing a great job, if you think, hey, Comic Indie, here's how you can be improving some things. Comic Indie, I found a great book. Comic Indie, I had a good sandwich. We want to hear from you. So you can find us on Facebook under Comic Indie. You can also, I believe we don't have a Twitter or anything.
We do have a Twitter.
We do have a Twitter?
Yeah.
We have a Twitter.
Yeah, we're one of those, secretive ones. But
Okay.
you can hit us on the DMs. But I'm just kidding. We have a Twitter out there. But best way to find us is comicindie.com. There you can find all of our amazing articles, videos, and content that we have on the web. You can find this podcast there as well. But definitely check out comicindie.com. Facebook page is definitely live and kicking. Got several views recently, so we're looking for several more. The Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram, we are all out there. I don't think we're snapping at this point.
Like us, share us, tell your friends and neighbors, yell it from the treetops, send strange cryptic notes in the mail to people you don't know, and advertising us. We'd really appreciate it.
You're good. Wrap it up. Let's wrap it up.
Okay, but once again, thank you for listening. My name is I am from the Once and Future Daniel.
And I'm Ken Javier.
And I'm Alex A.
And you've been listening to Comic Indie Podcast.
Comic Indie Podcasting Show.